The heat shield damage discovered after the Artemis worm test flight exemplifies this architectural tension. The shield experienced more material loss than predicted during Earth re-entry. Not enough to endanger the mission, but enough to require understanding before putting crew aboard. The investigation revealed that the problem stemmed from permeability variations in the material that weren't fully characterized during development. Fixing it requires either accepting the risk, modifying the material, or changing the re-entry trajectory. Each option carries cascading implications. Accepting the risk conflicts with modern safety standards. Modifying the material means redesigning, remanufacturing, and retesting the entire heat shield, years of work. Changing the re-entry trajectory affects mission planning, orbital mechanics, and recovery operations. There's no simple fix, because the architecture locks in certain constraints. This is what makes comparisons to Apollo frustrating for NASA engineers. Apollo had the luxury of clean sheet design, with essentially unlimited budget during critical development years. Every component could be optimized specifically for lunar missions without worrying about reusability, multi-purpose functionality, or cost constraints beyond beating the Soviets before 1970. Artemis inherits a patchwork of requirements, legacy systems, budget restrictions, and political demands that make clean optimization impossible. The architecture must accommodate commercial partnerships, international contributions, reusability goals, Mars-forward design decisions, and budget realities simultaneously. These constraints often conflict, forcing compromises that satisfy none of the objectives particularly well. The Gateway lunar station illustrates this perfectly. Gateway is a planned outpost that will orbit the Moon, serving as a staging point for lunar landings and eventually Mars missions. It's also a political necessity that accommodates international partners, particularly Canada, Europe, and Japan, who want roles in lunar exploration but can't contribute to landing systems as easily as to an orbital station. From a pure engineering standpoint, Gateway isn't necessary for initial Artemis landings. Apollo demonstrated direct-to-surface missions without orbital infrastructure. But Gateway serves multiple non-engineering purposes. Maintaining ISS partnerships in the post-ISS era, testing deep space systems, providing abort options for surface missions, and crucially, creating roles for international partners that justify their continued investment in the program. This political architecture shapes technical architecture in ways that increase complexity and cost. The lunar landers must be designed to dock with Gateway. Mission profiles include Gateway stopovers. Communication systems must account for Gateway's orbit. Each requirement adds mass, complexity, and failure modes. Commercial partnerships introduce another architectural layer. NASA isn't building the lunar landers directly. SpaceX's Starship HLS and Blue Origin's Blue Moon are commercial vehicles developed under NASA contracts, but owned by private companies with their own objectives beyond Artemis. Starship HLS is a variant of SpaceX's fully reusable Mars transportation system. The lunar version is expendable and heavily modified, but SpaceX is developing it primarily to advance Starship for Mars colonization, Elon Musk's stated long-term goal. NASA's requirements for Artemis are constraints on this larger architecture rather than the primary driver. This creates interesting tensions. SpaceX wants Starship to be rapidly reusable with minimal ground processing. NASA wants extensive testing and verification before each flight. SpaceX designs for Mars missions with different requirements than lunar missions. NASA needs specific capabilities for Artemis timelines. The resulting vehicle must satisfy both sets of demands, which don't always align. Blue Origin's approach differs but faces similar architectural challenges. Blue Moon is designed from the start as a lunar lander without the Mars-focused heritage of Starship. But Blue Origin is also developing it as part of Jeff Bezos's vision for space industrialization and eventual lunar resource utilization. The architecture must serve Artemis while remaining adaptable for Blue Origin's longer-term commercial objectives. These competing architectural visions, NASA's Artemis requirements, SpaceX's Mars focus, Blue Origin's industrial vision, international partners' priorities, must somehow integrate into a coherent system. The challenge isn't any single component. It's making them all work together despite being designed according to different philosophies for different ultimate purposes. The contrast with Apollo becomes stark. Apollo had one customer, the US government, one primary contractor, North American Aviation for the spacecraft, Boeing for the first stage, North American for the second stage, Douglas for the third stage, one overriding objective, beat the Soviets, and one architectural philosophy, get there safely before 1970, worry about sustainability later. Artemis has multiple customers with different priorities, multiple contractors with different business models, multiple objectives that sometimes conflict, and architectural requirements that must satisfy immediate needs while remaining adaptable for futures that haven't been fully defined. The system must be sustainable, reusable where possible, commercially viable, internationally collaborative, and technically superior, all while operating under budgets that don't approach Apollo-era spending levels. This architectural complexity explains why Artemis timelines keep slipping while costs rise. Each delay reveals another integration challenge. The Orion heat shield problem delays crew flights, which cascades to commercial lander development schedules, which affects gateway deployment, which impacts international partner contributions, which influences budget allocations, which feeds back into technical decisions about what can be afforded when. China's program avoids many of these architectural challenges through centralized control and sustained funding. The China National Space Administration doesn't balance commercial partnerships or navigate international cooperation frameworks. It doesn't redesign systems every 4 years when administrations change. It doesn't operate under annual budget uncertainty or contractor profit considerations. This doesn't make China's approach inherently superior. It trades different advantages for different constraints. But it does mean their architecture can remain more coherent across longer timescales. When they announce 2030 for lunar landing, the entire industrial and political system aligns toward that date without the constant renegotiation that characterizes Western programs. NASA's architectural challenge isn't primarily technical. The United States possesses the engineering capability to return to the Moon relatively quickly, if that were the only consideration. The challenge is building a system that satisfies all the non-technical requirements while remaining technically feasible under realistic budget and timeline constraints. Every architectural decision carries political, economic, and strategic implications that extend beyond engineering optimization. Choosing commercial landers over NASA-developed systems affects jobs, congressional support, and industrial-based considerations. Including Gateway affects international relationships and post-ISS cooperation. Reusability requirements affect development costs versus operational costs. Decisions that depend on how many missions you assume will actually fly. These aren't problems that can be engineered away. They're fundamental to how modern space programs operate in democratic systems with constrained budgets and competing priorities. The architecture that emerges from this process inevitably carries more complexity, more compromise, and more fragility than clean sheet programs with singular focus. Output word count, 2,250 words. Part 6, the human factor. The technological and political explanations only tell part of the story. there's another dimension to understanding our lunar absence. One that lives in the aging memories of those who made Apollo possible, and in the harsh reality of what we've lost by letting that knowledge slip away. Walk through NASA's Johnson Space Center today, and you'll find something sobering. The engineers who calculated trajectories by hand, who designed life support systems from first principles, who solved problems that had never existed before. They're in their 80s now. Some have passed away. The youngest person who worked on Apollo 11 is now 75 years old. This isn't just about nostalgia. It's about institutional knowledge that can't be fully captured in documentation. When those engineers solved problems during Apollo, they didn't just write down the solution. They understood the why behind every decision, the alternatives they rejected, the subtle factors that influenced each choice. That contextual understanding, the engineering intuition developed through direct experience, largely died when the program ended. Consider the F1 engine that powered the Saturn V's first stage. 5 of these monsters generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust, burning 3 tons of propellant per second. When NASA wanted to potentially revive this engine for modern use, they brought one out of museum storage and disassembled it completely. What they found was humbling. The engine contained hand-filed parts, components that had been individually adjusted by skilled machinists who knew from experience how the metal would behave under extreme conditions. The tolerances weren't always what the blueprint specified. They were what worked, discovered through trial and error by craftsmen whose expertise came from building these engines day after day. Modern engineers examining the hardware found modifications that weren't in any documentation, tweaks that someone had made and never recorded because everyone working on the line just knew that's how you did it. This tacit knowledge extended throughout Apollo. The seamstresses who hand-sewed the spacesuits understood how the fabric would perform under stress in ways that went beyond specifications. The technicians who assembled the lunar module knew which bolts needed an extra quarter turn, which seals required special attention, which instruments were temperamental and needed gentle handling. They developed this expertise through repetition, through building multiple units, through seeing what worked and what failed. All of that is gone. The factories that built Apollo hardware have been demolished or repurposed. The specialized tools were scrapped or sold off. The supply chains that produced unique materials and components dissolved when the orders stopped coming. The companies that existed solely to support Apollo either went bankrupt or pivoted to different industries. You can't just recreate this infrastructure from blueprints and specifications. Even if all the documentation were perfect, which it isn't, you'd still face the challenge of rebuilding an entire industrial ecosystem that no longer exists. Modern equivalents don't always work the same way. Materials have changed. Manufacturing processes have evolved. The vendors who supplied specific components are long gone. NASA learned this lesson when attempting to restart production of various Apollo-era systems. It's not like building a car where you can source parts from a catalog. Many Apollo components were one-off designs made by companies that don't exist anymore, using techniques that aren't practiced today. The institutional memory of how to manufacture these systems evaporated when production ended. This knowledge loss extends beyond hardware. Flight controllers who manage missions from Houston developed an intuitive understanding of spacecraft behavior. They could hear anomalies in radio chatter, recognize subtle patterns in telemetry data, make split-second decisions based on experience that couldn't be programmed into procedures. These skills developed through hundreds of hours of simulations and actual missions. When Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded, the The response that saved the crew's lives came partly from documented procedures, but largely from controllers and engineers who understood their spacecraft intimately enough to improvise solutions to problems they'd never anticipated. They knew which systems could be powered down, which combinations of equipment would work together, how far they could push components beyond rated limits. That intuitive mastery came from living and breathing these machines for years. We don't have that anymore. The current generation of engineers is brilliant and capable, but they're working with systems they didn't design, solving problems their predecessors never faced, operating under constraints that didn't exist during Apollo. They're building institutional knowledge from scratch rather than building on accumulated experience. The Space Shuttle program illustrated this challenge. Despite flying for 30 years, shuttle operations never achieved the casual confidence of Apollo-era missions. Each flight remained a carefully orchestrated event, requiring extensive preparation because the expertise to operate these complex vehicles developed more slowly than anticipated. The shuttle was supposed to fly weekly like an airliner. It never came close, partly because the learning curve for safe operations proved steeper than anyone expected. Risk tolerance has fundamentally changed as well, and this isn't just about safety culture. It's about what society will accept. Apollo operated under risk calculations that would be completely unacceptable today. NASA estimated that early Apollo missions had roughly a 1 in 10 chance of catastrophic failure. They flew them anyway because the political imperative outweighed the risk. The Apollo 1 fire that killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a ground test would likely end a program today. Instead, NASA paused for modifications, then continued with barely diminished urgency. The culture accepted that pioneering spaceflight was dangerous and astronauts might die in the attempt. The public mourned but supported continuing. That calculus has shifted dramatically. The Challenger and Columbia disasters, each killing 7 astronauts, prompted years-long program suspensions and fundamental re-evaluations. Modern NASA operates under intense scrutiny, where any serious anomaly triggers extensive investigations and potential program delays. This caution is appropriate and necessary, but it means that the acceptable risk threshold for lunar missions has dropped, while the actual risks haven't decreased proportionally. Artemis must meet safety standards that Apollo never faced. Every system requires multiple redundancies. Abort options must exist throughout the mission profile. Radiation exposure limits are stricter. Life support must handle longer missions with wider safety margins. These requirements are sensible, but they add mass, complexity, and cost that Apollo avoided by accepting higher risks. The astronaut selection process reflects this shift. Apollo astronauts were test pilots accustomed to flying experimental aircraft where crashes were relatively common. They accepted danger as inherent to their profession. Modern astronauts are still brave and capable, but they're selected partly for their ability to work within highly structured safety protocols. The culture has evolved from pioneering edge-of-the-envelope flying to operating sophisticated systems with minimal risk tolerance. This creates tension between ambition and acceptable risk. Public and political support for space exploration depends partly on perceived safety. A catastrophic failure during Artemis could delay lunar programs for decades, as happened with Apollo 1 and the shuttle disasters. This risk aversion is rational but inherently conservative, favoring incremental progress over bold leaps. The human factors extend to mission design as well. Apollo astronauts spent about 3 days traveling to the moon, a few days on the surface, then 3 days returning. Total mission duration was roughly 10 days. They accepted radiation exposure levels that would exceed modern limits. They tolerated cramped conditions that would violate current habitability standards. They operated with minimal privacy, basic hygiene facilities, and limited food variety. Artemis missions must meet contemporary expectations for crew comfort and health. Longer surface stays require more sophisticated habitats. Radiation shielding must reduce exposure to acceptable levels. Psychological support for extended isolation needs consideration. These human factors drive requirements that Apollo largely ignored because missions were short enough to just endure the discomfort. Gender integration adds complexity Apollo never addressed. All Apollo astronauts were men, allowing NASA to design systems around relatively uniform physiology. Artemis commits to landing the first woman on the moon, requiring spacesuits, equipment, and facilities that accommodate broader physical variation. This is obviously the right approach, but it represents additional design variables that Apollo didn't face. Training requirements have expanded enormously as well. Apollo astronauts trained intensively, but for relatively straightforward missions: fly to the moon, land, conduct experiments, return. Artemis astronauts must prepare for extended surface operations, habitat assembly, equipment maintenance, scientific research, and potential emergency scenarios across longer timelines. They need geological training for sample collection, mechanical skills for repairs, medical capability for health emergencies, and scientific expertise for experiments. The psychological dimension matters more for longer missions. 3 days to the moon and back is a sprint. Extended lunar stays are marathons requiring different mental preparation. Crew selection must consider not just technical competence, but psychological resilience, team dynamics, and ability to handle isolation for weeks or months. Apollo assessed these factors, but with less emphasis because mission durations were shorter. Public engagement presents its own challenges. Apollo captured global attention because it was unprecedented and happened during an era of limited media competition. The first moon landing drew an estimated 600 million television viewers, roughly 1/5 of Earth's population at the time. It dominated news coverage for weeks. Recreating that cultural moment seems nearly impossible in today's fragmented media environment. Space competes with countless other stories for public attention. Missions that would have been headline news during Apollo might barely trend on social media today. This affects political support, which depends partly on public enthusiasm, which drives funding, which determines program viability. NASA understands this challenge and has invested heavily in public outreach, social media presence, and efforts to make Artemis culturally relevant. But capturing sustained public imagination, comparable to Apollo, requires more than good communications. It requires a compelling narrative that resonates with contemporary concerns and aspirations. The educational pipeline matters too. Apollo inspired a generation of students to pursue careers in science and engineering. Enrollment in these fields surged during the 1960s and 1970s, creating a workforce that drove technological innovation for decades. That inspirational effect has proven difficult to recreate without a galvanizing goal equivalent to beating the Soviets to the moon. Current space programs struggle to generate similar enthusiasm among young people who have numerous career options and competing interests. The connection between space exploration and everyday life feels more abstract than during Apollo, when space technology visibly translated into consumer products and national security advantages. Maintaining the specialized workforce needed for ambitious space programs requires sustained educational emphasis that has been inconsistent since Apollo ended. International cooperation introduces human factors that Apollo avoided through American unilateralism. Artemis partners bring different organizational cultures, communication styles, decision-making processes, and operational philosophies. Integrating multinational crews requires addressing language barriers, cultural differences, and varying expectations about hierarchy and authority. These aren't insurmountable challenges, but they add complexity to training, operations, and mission planning. The contractor workforce presents its own dynamics. Apollo employed hundreds of thousands of workers whose jobs depended on program continuation. This created constituencies with strong incentives to maintain support for space exploration. When Apollo ended, this workforce dispersed into other industries. Rebuilding it means competing for talent with technology companies, defense contractors, and other sectors offering comparable or better compensation. Retaining expertise has become particularly challenging in the space industry. Young engineers often view aerospace as less dynamic or lucrative than software, biotechnology, or other fields. Space programs can't offer the rapid advancement or stock options that tech companies provide. This talent competition affects NASA's ability to maintain the workforce needed for ambitious programs. The aging of the existing aerospace workforce compounds this challenge. Many experienced engineers who worked on shuttle or earlier programs are retiring without necessarily passing their knowledge to successors. The industry has struggled to maintain continuity as veterans leave and new hires must learn from documentation rather than mentorship. What we've lost by leaving the moon for 50 years extends beyond technology and infrastructure. We've lost the living memory of how to do this, the accumulated wisdom of people who solved these problems in real time, who understood spacecraft as physical machines they could touch and modify, who developed intuition through hands-on experience that can't be fully captured in manuals or simulations. Artemis isn't just rebuilding hardware, it's rebuilding capability from partial blueprints, incomplete documentation, and fading memories of how things actually worked versus how they were supposed to work. It's recreating an industrial base that dissolved. It's developing expertise that died with the last Apollo mission. This human dimension of lunar exploration, the knowledge, the risk tolerance, the cultural context, the public engagement, the workforce challenges, represents obstacles as significant as any technical or political barrier. You can't just decide to go to the moon and immediately do it, even if you've been there before. Too much has been lost. Too much must be relearned or reinvented. The real question isn't just why we haven't returned to the moon. It's whether we can return, not technically, but as a civilization that has largely forgotten how. Yet something remarkable is happening right now. Something that might finally break this 50-year stalemate. China announced in 2023 that it plans to land astronauts on the moon by 2030. Not eventually, not someday, 2030. They've already demonstrated the capability with robotic missions, including retrieving samples from the lunar far side, something no nation had achieved until their Chang'e 6 mission in 2024. They're building the rockets, training the astronauts, developing the landers, and they're doing it all with a level of focus and sustained commitment that hasn't existed in American space policy since Kennedy. This should sound familiar. It's almost exactly how the original space race began. October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. Americans looked up at the night sky and saw a blinking light passing overhead, a light that represented Soviet technology orbiting above American territory every 90 minutes. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Soviets could put a satellite over America, they could put a nuclear weapon over America. The space race wasn't really about space. It was about demonstrating technological superiority that directly translated to military capability. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Another Soviet victory. Another demonstration that America was losing the most important technological competition of the era. President Kennedy needed a goal ambitious enough that America's industrial might could overcome the Soviet head start. Something so difficult that previous Soviet achievements wouldn't matter. 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight, Kennedy committed America to landing on the moon before 1970. That context, existential Cold War competition with clear winners and losers, created the political will to spend whatever Apollo required. When Kennedy made his promise, NASA didn't know how to get to the moon. The technology didn't exist. The rockets weren't powerful enough. The spacecraft weren't designed. The techniques weren't developed. But the commitment came first, and the solutions followed, because failure wasn't politically acceptable. Does China create similar pressure today? Some NASA officials certainly hope so. They've watched administrations cancel and restart lunar programs for decades. They've seen Constellation announce with fanfare in 2004, then cancelled in 2010. They've witnessed the Artemis program slip repeatedly, with landing dates moving from 2024 to 2025 to 2027 to who knows. Political support remains tepid, budgets stay constrained, and then China announces specific timelines for putting taikonauts on the lunar surface. Suddenly, congressional hearings feature different questions. Not, why should we go to the moon? But, what happens if China gets there first? That shift in framing matters enormously. The first question requires justifying lunar exploration on scientific or economic merits, a difficult argument when Earth faces pressing problems. The second question frames lunar access as strategic competition where falling behind has consequences. But here's what's different from the 1960s. This isn't really a race. The Soviet Union and United States were locked in genuine zero-sum competition. Every Soviet first in space represented an American failure. When Gagarin orbited Earth, that was a permanent achievement Americans could never claim. The pressure to respond with a dramatic accomplishment, landing on the moon, came from the need to demonstrate superior capability after falling behind. China reaching the moon in 2030 doesn't prevent America from landing in 2027 or 2032 or whenever Artemis finally flies. There's no finish line that closes once someone crosses it. The moon isn't going anywhere. Chinese astronauts exploring the lunar South Pole doesn't stop American astronauts from doing the same. This is more like a parallel development than a race, which means the competitive pressure might not be enough. China's program has advantages the American program lacks, and limitations America has avoided. The Chinese space program operates within an authoritarian system that can sustain long-term technical projects without worrying about election cycles or budget fights. When China commits to landing on the moon by 2030, that goal doesn't change when leadership changes. The same political structure that enables this consistency also restricts China's access to international partnerships, technology sharing, and the talent pool that comes from open collaboration. America's messy democratic process creates frustrating inconsistency in space policy, but it also enables the kind of public-private partnerships that have revolutionized spaceflight in the last decade. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other commercial companies exist because American policy encouraged private sector space development. China's state-controlled approach can't easily replicate this model. So we have competing systems pursuing similar goals through different methods. China follows a methodical state-directed path similar to the Soviet approach. America stumbles forward through a chaotic mix of government programs, commercial partnerships, and political turbulence. Neither approach is clearly superior. Both might succeed. Both might fail. What's certain is that China's timeline adds urgency to American planning in a way that pure scientific interest never could. Consider how quickly attitudes shifted. For years, proposals for lunar missions struggled to gain traction. Mars sounded more exciting. Asteroids offered unique science. Low Earth orbit provided practical applications. The Moon seemed like somewhere we'd already been, a destination without novelty. Then China started publishing detailed plans for lunar infrastructure. And suddenly, American policymakers remembered why controlling access to the Moon might matter. The Moon's south pole contains ice deposits that could support sustained human presence. Those ice deposits could be converted to rocket fuel, enabling missions deeper into the solar system without launching all propellant from Earth. Whoever develops the capability to exploit those resources first establishes operational presence that others must work around. This isn't Cold War competition, but it's not purely cooperative either. International space law remains vague about resource extraction and territorial claims. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits national sovereignty claims, but doesn't clearly address whether countries can establish exclusive economic zones or claim resources they've extracted. As multiple nations develop lunar capability, these legal ambiguities will be tested. The first nation to establish permanent infrastructure might effectively create facts on the ground, or rather on the Moon, that shape how international space law evolves. That strategic dimension gives lunar exploration a significance beyond science or inspiration. It's not enough to create the kind of urgent political commitment that drove Apollo, but it might be enough to sustain Artemis through the political inconsistency that has killed previous programs. Maybe. The Artemis program, as currently structured, reflects all the contradictions of modern space policy. It combines elements that make sense with elements that exist purely for political reasons. The Space Launch System rocket, NASA's heavy lift vehicle for lunar missions, has been in development since 2011 and has cost over $50 billion. It's built using space shuttle components and technology because Congress mandated that approach to preserve jobs in districts where shuttle contractors operated. It's not the rocket engineers would design starting from scratch, but it's the rocket that could gain congressional approval. The Orion spacecraft follows a similar pattern. Development began under the Constellation program in 2006, survived that program's cancellation, and continued under Artemis. It's capable and well designed, but it's also expensive and carries legacy requirements from previous programs. Each Orion capsule costs roughly $1 billion. Meanwhile, SpaceX is developing Starship, a fully reusable spacecraft that could potentially carry 100 people to the Moon at a fraction of the cost per launch. Starship is also years behind schedule and facing major technical challenges, but its design philosophy represents a completely different approach to spaceflight economics. NASA is hedging by partnering with SpaceX for the lunar lander, while maintaining the SLS and Orion for crew transport. This mixed architecture, government-developed launch vehicle and capsule, commercially developed lander, creates complexity that Apollo avoided. Apollo used a consistent design philosophy across all hardware. Artemis combines different philosophies, different contractors, different development timelines. It might work brilliantly, with each element providing its strengths, or the interfaces between these different systems might create delays and problems. The international partnerships add another layer of complexity and capability. Unlike Apollo's purely American hardware, Artemis includes major contributions from Europe, Japan, Canada, and other partners. The Lunar Gateway Station will orbit the Moon as a staging point for surface missions, with modules and systems from multiple countries. This spreads costs and builds international support, but it also means delays in one country's hardware affect the entire program. Canada is providing the Canadarm3 robotic system. Europe is building service modules for Orion. Japan is contributing life support and logistics modules. These partnerships create diplomatic benefits beyond spaceflight capability. They bind allied nations together in a shared project that strengthens relationships across multiple domains. But they also mean Artemis can't move faster than its slowest partner, so we have a program that's simultaneously more ambitious and more constrained than Apollo. The goal isn't just landing and returning, it's establishing infrastructure for sustained presence. That's harder and more expensive, but it's also more valuable if achieved. The challenge is whether political will and funding can sustain through the decades this will require. The current timeline has Artemis 2, the first crewed flight around the Moon, launching in 2026. Artemis 3, the landing mission, is scheduled for 2027, though that date keeps slipping. Even if those missions succeed, they represent the beginning of the program, not its completion. The real test comes in the 2030s, when maintaining lunar presence requires consistent funding through multiple election cycles and competing budget priorities. This is where China's competition might actually help. A successful Chinese landing in 2030 would create pressure to accelerate Artemis. A Chinese announcement of permanent lunar infrastructure plans would force American policymakers to decide whether maintaining leadership in space exploration justifies sustained investment. The existence of a credible competitor provides political cover for spending that would be harder to justify otherwise. But it's not the same as the Apollo-era space race, because the consequences of falling behind aren't as clear. If China reaches the Moon first, what actually happens? America doesn't lose the Cold War. The economic and military balance doesn't shift. There's no immediate strategic consequence beyond the symbolic blow of letting another nation claim the achievement. That's the fundamental problem with using competition to drive space exploration in the 21st century. The competition isn't urgent enough to override other priorities, but it's significant enough to matter. It exists in an awkward middle ground where it influences decisions without determining them. Which brings us back to the question of whether we can actually do this. Technically, yes. The hardware is being built, the technology exists or is being developed. The engineering challenges are solvable. Artemis will eventually launch, and barring catastrophic failure, it will eventually land Americans on the Moon again. The question isn't capability, it's will. Can we sustain commitment through the inevitable setbacks and delays? Can we maintain funding when other priorities emerge? Can we accept the risks that spaceflight necessarily entails? Can we rebuild the cultural consensus that space exploration deserves significant national resources? Those aren't technical questions. They're human questions about what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve it. Apollo answered those questions in a specific historical moment that hasn't repeated. The 1960s provided a unique convergence. Existential competition with a geopolitical rival, economic prosperity that made massive spending feasible, technological optimism that believed any problem could be solved, and political leadership willing to commit to a goal that wouldn't be achieved during their time in office. Kennedy didn't live to see the Moon landing. Johnson's presidency ended before Apollo 11. Nixon inherited the program and reaped the political benefits without bearing the political costs of its creation. That alignment is what we're really missing. Not rockets or technology or engineering expertise, though those matter. What's absent is the cultural and political alignment that makes committing hundreds of billions of dollars to space exploration seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Consider the differences. Apollo had singular focus. Beat the Soviets to the Moon. Artemis has multiple objectives. Establish sustainable presence, enable commercial activity, conduct scientific research, demonstrate American leadership. cooperate with international partners, develop technologies for Mars. That's not a criticism. Those are legitimate goals. But they create complexity that Apollo avoided. When your objective is, get there first, decision-making simplifies. When your objective is build permanent infrastructure while balancing commercial interests and international cooperation, every decision involves trade-offs between competing priorities. Apollo could accept risks that would be unthinkable today. The probability of crew loss on any given Apollo mission was estimated at around 2%. That's not a hypothetical number. It's based on the actual failures and near failures that occurred. We lost 3 astronauts in the Apollo 1 fire. We nearly lost 3 more during Apollo 13. There were engine shutdowns, guidance failures, parachute malfunctions. The program succeeded despite operating at risk levels that would ground any modern program instantly. Modern spaceflight operates under different assumptions about acceptable risk. The Space Shuttle disasters, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, each led to years-long groundings and fundamental program reviews. The loss of crew isn't accepted as an inevitable cost of exploration anymore. It's treated as a failure of the system that requires comprehensive investigation and reform. That's probably the right ethical position, but it makes programs slower and more expensive. It also changes the political calculation. Apollo could afford to be aggressive because the entire program spanned less than a decade. If something went wrong, there was time to fix it and still meet Kennedy's deadline. Artemis doesn't have that luxury. A single catastrophic failure could end the program entirely. Congress won't continue funding a program that kills astronauts, especially when there's no existential reason the program must succeed. That's the fundamental difference. Apollo had to succeed because failure meant losing the Cold War's most visible competition. Artemis wants to succeed, but failure doesn't have the same consequences. If China lands first, America doesn't lose a war. If Artemis gets cancelled, NASA continues other programs. The stakes are real, but not existential, which means commitment is conditional rather than absolute. This brings us to the question of whether the current approach can work. Can you achieve Apollo-level results without Apollo-level urgency and resources? Can you build sustainable lunar infrastructure on a budget that's a fraction of what Apollo spent? Can you maintain political support through the inevitable setbacks that complex programs encounter? The optimistic case says yes, because we're not starting from scratch. We know how to get to the moon. We've done it before. The engineering isn't theoretical, it's proven. Modern technology should make things easier, not harder. Computers are millions of times more powerful. Materials science has advanced. We have decades of spaceflight experience to draw from. The pessimistic case says no, because the very things that should make it easier actually make it harder. Modern safety standards require more testing and validation. International partnerships create coordination overhead. Commercial involvement adds profit motives that sometimes conflict with mission objectives. The accumulated bureaucracy of a 70-year-old agency creates inertia that slows decision-making. We're trying to do something harder than Apollo. Establish permanent presence rather than just plant a flag. With less money and less political support. The realistic case says maybe, depending on factors that have nothing to do with technology. If China's program creates sufficient political pressure, Artemis could receive increased funding and priority. If early missions succeed without major failures, public support could build. If commercial partners like SpaceX deliver reusable systems that dramatically reduce costs, the economic equation changes. If the program survives long enough to establish actual lunar infrastructure, it might develop its own political constituency that makes it harder to cancel. But all of those are conditional. They require things to go right in ways that aren't guaranteed. Which is why, when people ask whether we can return to the moon, the honest answer is, we can. But will we? The can part is engineering. The will part is everything else. Politics, economics, culture, priorities. And that's what makes this moment interesting. We're watching in real time whether modern America can accomplish something that 1960s America achieved. Not because we lack the capability, but because we might lack the will. There's something almost poetic about that. We reached the moon at the height of American technological optimism, when it seemed like no problem was too big to solve. We stopped going when that optimism faded, when other problems seemed more pressing, when the political will that drove Apollo dissolved into other priorities. Now we're trying to return in an era of skepticism about large government programs, of constrained budgets and competing demands, of political polarization that makes sustained multi-decade commitments nearly impossible. If Artemis succeeds, it won't be because returning to the moon got easier. It'll be because we figured out how to achieve hard things under conditions that make achievement harder. That might actually be more impressive than Apollo, even if it's less dramatic. Apollo proved we could reach the moon when everything aligned in our favor. Artemis would prove we can return when nothing is aligned, when we have to fight for every dollar and justify every decision and maintain commitment across election cycles and budget battles. That's a different kind of achievement. Less glorious perhaps, more grinding, but maybe more meaningful, because it would represent a choice to prioritize exploration, even when it's not easy or obvious or politically necessary. The next few years will answer the question. Artemis 2 will either launch in 2026 or it won't. Artemis 3 will either land on the moon in 2027 or it won't. China will either beat us there or they won't. The program will either survive its first major setback or it won't. And through all of this, we'll discover whether 21st century America can do what 20th century America did. Commit to a goal that extends beyond the next election cycle and pursue it with enough consistency to actually achieve it. The moon hasn't changed. It's still there, still 240,000 miles away, still waiting. What's changed is us, our priorities, our politics, our willingness to attempt difficult things for reasons beyond immediate necessity. The real question isn't whether we can return to the moon. It's whether we want to badly enough to actually do it. And that question doesn't have a technical answer. It has a human one. It depends on what we decide matters, what we're willing to pay for, what we're willing to risk, what we're willing to sustain. The hardware is being built. The plans are being made. The capability exists. What remains uncertain is whether the will exists to see it through. That's what makes this different from Apollo. Kennedy could declare a goal and marshal resources to achieve it because the political and cultural moment supported that kind of national commitment. We don't live in that moment anymore. We live in a moment of divided priorities and constrained resources and skepticism about grand projects. Returning to the moon means doing it anyway, despite the obstacles rather than because they've been removed. Which is why the answer to why haven't we been back to the moon ultimately comes down to this: because it's hard, it's expensive, and we haven't wanted it badly enough to overcome those obstacles. Whether that changes depends less on engineering than on collective choice. The moon is waiting. The question is whether we're ready to go back. We've already spent over $50 billion on Artemis. The space launch system has flown once. Orion has completed one test flight. The lunar landers are in development. Gateway modules are being built in facilities across multiple countries. This isn't theoretical anymore. It's hardware being assembled, tested, integrated. But here's what nobody wants to say out loud. we could still not go. Not because the rockets won't work, not because the engineering is impossible, but because somewhere between now and actually landing on the moon, funding could get cut, priorities could shift. A new administration could decide Mars makes a better talking point. A catastrophic failure during testing could trigger risk aversion that grounds the program for years. The slow accumulation of delays and cost overruns could erode political support until Congress just quietly stops appropriating money. This has happened before, multiple times. Constellation was real, hardware was being built, then it was cancelled. The shuttle was supposed to fly weekly. It flew 135 times in 30 years before retirement. The ISS was supposed to be completed by the mid-90s. The first modules launched in 1998. Plans change, promises get broken, programs die. What's different this time is China. Not because they're an enemy, they're not, at least not in the Cold War sense, but because they represent proof that sustained commitment to space exploration is possible. They've been building their program methodically for 30 years. No dramatic cancellations, no radical changes in direction every 4 years. Just steady progress toward clearly defined goals. Their approach reveals something uncomfortable about the American system. We're better at sprints than marathons. Apollo was a sprint, 8 years of intense focus with essentially unlimited resources. We're amazing at that. We invented the atomic bomb in less time. We can mobilize incredible capability when national survival seems to depend on it. But marathons require different skills: consistency, patience, the ability to maintain effort across decades without immediate payoff. Democratic systems with election cycles and budget fights struggle with this, not because democracy is bad, it's not, but because it creates incentives for short-term thinking. Politicians need wins during their terms. Programs that won't pay off for 15 years don't help them get re-elected. China's authoritarian system doesn't face these constraints. When they commit to 2030, that date doesn't change because of elections. The engineers working on their Lunar program know their funding will continue. They can plan for the long term without wondering if the next administration will cancel everything. This creates a paradox. The system that gives us freedom and prosperity struggles with the kind of sustained technical programs that authoritarian systems handle well. We're watching that play out in real time with Artemis. The program exists, it's making progress, but it's constantly vulnerable to political winds in ways that China's program isn't. Some people find this depressing. I find it clarifying, because it means the question isn't really about technology or money, or even politics in the traditional sense. It's about whether democratic societies can commit to goals that extend beyond election cycles, whether we can build things that take decades to complete, whether we can maintain focus on projects that won't pay off until current leaders are out of office. That's harder than building rockets, way harder. The moon is testing this. Not the moon itself, that's just rock and dust and vacuum, same as it's always been. But the idea of returning there, of establishing permanent presence, of doing something because it's hard and important, rather than because it's easy or immediately profitable, that's the test. Apollo passed it by, operating in a unique historical moment that hasn't repeated and probably never will. Artemis has to pass it under normal conditions. Normal budgets, normal politics, normal competing priorities, without the Cold War urgency that made spending 4% of the federal budget on spaceflight seem reasonable. Can we do that? Technically, obviously yes. We have the rockets, the spacecraft, the knowledge, the industrial base. The question is whether we'll actually follow through. Whether we'll keep funding Artemis through 2027, 2030, 2035. Whether we'll maintain the program when the inevitable setbacks occur. Whether we'll accept the risks that spaceflight entails. Whether we'll prioritize this over other things we could spend hundreds of billions of dollars on, those questions don't have clear answers yet. They depend on choices that haven't been made, political decisions that haven't been forced, budget battles that haven't been fought. We're living in the uncertain middle of a story whose ending isn't written. What we do know is that the infrastructure exists to return. The institutional knowledge is being rebuilt, slowly and expensively, but it's happening. The commercial space industry has created capabilities that didn't exist during Apollo. International partnerships have broadened the base of support. The technology has advanced in ways that make some aspects easier, even as modern requirements make others harder. We also know that China is coming. They're not racing us in the Apollo sense. There's no finish line that closes once someone crosses it, but they're methodically building capability that will eventually put taikonauts on the lunar surface. Whether that happens in 2030 or 2032 or 2035, it's going to happen unless something catastrophic derails their program. And when it does, America will face the choice of whether lunar presence matters enough to sustain our own program. That choice might be easier if we've already landed. If Artemis 3 succeeds in 2027 or whenever it actually flies, if Americans are walking on the moon when China arrives, the political equation changes. We're not playing catch-up. We're not responding to their achievement. We're already there, already established, already building infrastructure. That creates momentum that's harder to stop. But if we haven't landed yet when China succeeds, if Artemis is still struggling with delays and cost overruns and technical challenges, the pressure intensifies in unpredictable ways. Some people will argue, we need to accelerate to compete. Others will argue we've already lost, so why bother? The political consensus that barely sustains Artemis now could fracture completely. That's why the next few years matter so much. Artemis 2 in 2026 will prove we can send crew beyond low Earth orbit with modern systems. It'll demonstrate that Orion works, that SLS can fly crew, that the ground systems function. That's psychologically important, even though it doesn't land anyone. It shows progress, momentum, capability. Then Artemis 3 becomes the real test. Can we actually land? Can we do the thing we did 6 times in the early 1970s, but haven't done since? Can we prove that all this investment and effort and political capital actually delivers what it promised? If those missions succeed, Artemis develops its own constituency, contractors who want continued work, congressional districts with jobs that depend on the program, international partners who've invested in Gateway, commercial companies that see business opportunities, scientists who want to study lunar samples, engineers who want to solve hard problems. That coalition creates political resilience that makes cancellation harder. If they fail, or if they keep getting delayed indefinitely, the program becomes vulnerable. Every delay erodes support. Every cost overrun strengthens critics. Every technical problem raises questions about whether this is actually achievable. The coalition supporting Artemis is fragile. It requires success to strengthen it, so we're at an inflection point. The investments have been made. The hardware exists. The timeline stretches ahead. What happens next depends on execution. Technical, political, economic. Can NASA and its partners actually deliver working systems on schedules that maintain support? Can Congress maintain funding through inevitable challenges? Can the public sustain interest in something that might take another decade to fully realize? Nobody knows. We're making this up as we go along, trying to return to a place we left 50 years ago, using methods that didn't exist when we were last there. Combining government programs with commercial partnerships, with international cooperation, in ways that create new capabilities and new vulnerabilities simultaneously. It's messy, it's expensive, it's politically fragile, it's taking way longer than anyone wants, but it might actually work. Not because it's inevitable. Nothing about this is inevitable. But because enough people want it badly enough to keep pushing through the obstacles. The moon isn't going anywhere. It'll still be there in 2027, or 2030, or 2040. The question isn't whether humans can return. We obviously can. The question is whether we will. Whether we'll make the choices, accept the costs, sustain the commitment necessary to actually do it. And that question is being answered right now, in budget negotiations and technical reviews and political debates and engineering decisions happening across NASA centers and contractor facilities and congressional offices. The answer emerges not from any single decision, but from thousands of small choices that collectively determine whether Artemis succeeds or becomes another cancelled program that future historians write about. What we're really asking when we ask, why haven't we been back to the moon, is why we stop doing hard things that don't have immediate payoff. Why we struggle to maintain focus on projects that take decades. Why we find it difficult to invest in futures beyond the next election cycle. Those aren't space questions, they're civilization questions. About what we value, what we're willing to work for, what we believe is worth doing even when it's hard. Apollo answered those questions one way, in one specific historical moment. We're trying to answer them differently now, under different conditions, with different constraints. Whether we succeed will tell us something important about ourselves, not just about our technical capability, but about our collective will to attempt difficult things for reasons beyond immediate necessity. The moon is still there, exactly where it's always been, waiting to see if we're ready to come back. The real question is whether we're ready to do what it takes to actually get there. Not just talk about it, not just plan for it, not just build some hardware before cancelling the program when priorities shift. Actually go, actually land, actually stay. That's what the next few years will reveal. Not whether we can, we obviously can, whether we will. And in answering that question, we'll learn something fundamental about what 21st century America is capable of when faced with challenges that extend beyond quarterly earnings and election cycles and immediate gratification. The moon doesn't care about our politics or our budgets or our competing priorities. It's just there, 240,000 miles away, the same as it's been for billions of years. Whether we return depends entirely on us, on choices we make, on commitments we keep or break, on whether we decide this matters enough to actually follow through. 52 years is a long time to be away from somewhere we figured out how to reach in 8. That gap tells a story about what happens when political will evaporates, when priorities shift, when the circumstances that enabled achievement don't repeat. But it doesn't have to be the end of the story. We could write a different ending, one where we return, where we stay, where we build something permanent that outlasts any single administration or budget cycle or political moment. Whether that happens isn't determined yet. We're living in the uncertain middle, watching whether modern America can accomplish something that 1960s America achieved.